look at the way that that God's word is continuing to prosper no matter what man is trying to do. As we see the genesis of the church starting in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost, the way that the Christians had first started receiving a lot of popularity, but the persecution starts from the top down. And it just kind of, I'm not sure who we have here. Oh, somebody from India joining us. Well, good morning from wherever you're at in India. And as we see the church growing and the growing pains, but the gospel as well. So we have the individual interactions that we have with the Christians in the local churches, but also the gospel being taken forward out. The first section of Acts from 1 to 10, we find the workings of the church primarily in the Jerusalem, Judean region. It kind of the changing point is when we find Cornelius' household being introduced to the gospel and being accepted, and then that report back to Jerusalem and the way that Peter had to respond to it and defend it, and the church openly received it. I think we kind of noticed that there's some resistance starting to grow within the church. These Judaizing Christians are starting to, show their roots, because what they were familiar with, and it's common with many people, bringing in their prior beliefs and value systems into the church and starting to try to inject those somehow, which is very dangerous. Happens all the time, even today. So we're now at a point where we see another form of persecution, but also victory, because of the way that the Lord works, that a lot of times we don't see it. We see things many times that what God has accomplished in our lives after it's happened. And it's very overwhelming as we're trying to cope with what's going on in our lives. And we fail to see that God is with us and God is continuing to help us in there. So let's go ahead and read chapter 12, verse 1. We'll read down what we've already covered and do a little bit of review, and then we'll jump in to verse 12 and do a little more in depth. So chapter 12, Acts, verse 1. About that time, Herod the king laid violent hands on some who belonged to the church. He killed James, brother of John, with a sword. And when he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter also. This was during the days of the unleavened bread. And when he had seized him, he put him in prison, delivered him over to 4 squads of soldiers to guard him, intending after Passover to bring him out to the people. So Peter was kept in prison, but earnest prayer for him was being made to God by the church. Now when Herod was about to bring him out on that very night, Peter was sleeping between 2 soldiers, bound with 2 chains, and sentries before the door were guarding the prison. And behold, an angel of the Lord stood next to him, and a light shone in the cell. He struck Peter on the side, and he woke him, saying, "Get up quickly." And the chains fell off his hands. And the angel said to him, "Dress yourself and put on your sandals." And he did so. And he said to him, "Wrap your cloak around you and follow me." And he went out and he followed him. And he did not know that what was being done by the angel was real, but he thought he was seeing a vision. When they had passed the first and the second guard, and then they came to the iron gate leading into the city, it opened for them of its own accord. And when they went out and went along the street, and immediately the angel left him. When Peter came to himself, he said, "Now I am sure the Lord has sent his angel and rescued me from the hand of Herod and from all the things that Jewish people were expecting." So when we look at this persecution as during the time of unleavened, I think it's important. It's one of the major feast days. It's one of the times that it's the most passionate and zealous people are gathering there, traveling from all over the Mediterranean region, from wherever they're at, and coming there to celebrate these mandated feast days that were according to Mosaic law. This was the same time when the day of Pentecost, whenever the Jews had been there, coming there and traveling there. So Herod was one of these snakes where he would do whatever he needed to do to please the people. And this is where we find, and we're going to go all the way through this because we're going to see his demise, but him trying to please the people in order to maintain peace. So you have to ask the question, what triggered this? That just didn't haphazardly. I mean, there's already been numerous feasts of the unleavened where the Christians were there, all these people were there. There's been many years have lapsed from the time of Pentecost to this one, but something has happened where now Herod seizes James and beheads him and arrests Peter. And I believe that it's because of the persecution that's building up and the hatred from the Pharisees and the Sadducees, basically stirring things up in this anger. Now, Herod, you know, he is a survivor. One of the things that's unique about Herod is the fact that, one, we understand his grandfather is the one that when Jesus was born, and then he was so afraid that he then had the children executed and murdered. And then we find that even this Herod, his father was killed by his grandfather, and then he was taken off to Rome and raised there. He got in trouble financially. He was imprisoned actually while he was in Rome, but he seemed to learn how to negotiate. As the old saying, when in Rome, what? Live as Rome, be as Rome. And that's what Herod did. Herod made some very powerful Roman friends. Caligula, the emperor at the time, he became entrusted with this mad emperor and eventually was then placed into power and goes back. So he knows both worlds. He's walking a fine line. He understands that in order to maintain his rule, he's going to have to please both. But he also knows that to please the Romans, he needs to please the Jews. Because the Jews, if they're upset, they're going to cause trouble. If they cause trouble, then it's going to make the Romans mad. So he did a lot of wonderful things. I mean, from the Jewish perspective, one, he moved the capital from Caesarea back to Jerusalem. The Alexandrian Jews that were not being treated fairly, which is beyond his realm, he interceded for them and helped them receive some aid. He did a lot of things. He was responsible for helping to restore one of the major walls in building that. So he, you know, but he wasn't doing it out of pure motives. It was honestly out of trying to keep the Jewish population happy. So this is where I come back to this. I think that what happened is when Herod is there during this feast, that the leaders probably came to him very upset and wanting him to take action, to do something. And his action was to grab the ringleaders, grab those that are causing a part of it. He respected the Jewish faith to some level, but these Christians were still considered a cult, a group of rebels that were causing problems. So you can see from his point of view, he's going to have to try to put it down and to please the leaders, the Jewish leaders. So he arrests James. Now, this is the James, we talked about this last week, is the James, the brother of John, the beloved one. He's a part of the inner circle. James, John, Peter were considered a part of that inner circle of all the disciples and shared a transfiguration moment, you know, and so it's kind of interesting that these, he is the first one to be martyred. And during this type of being the first apostle to be martyred, he as well is not replaced. This is something that is kind of sometimes forgotten about, this aspect. One, that he is an apostle. Two, that he is one of the inner circle, the beloved of Jesus. And also the fact that James, being the brother of John, were the two brothers that their mother had came to the Lord and said, you know, I want to put them in power, put one on the left and one on the right. And Jesus asked that very bold statement, a question to them, hey, can you drink of this cup? referring to the cup that Jesus was going to experience, the suffering and death, martyrdom, basically. And they absolutely said, yes, we can endure this. And so James is one of the very first ones to be martyred. John, his brother, is going to be the last disciple to die. Now, he doesn't die of martyrdom. And then Peter, it's interesting that he continues to live. And so sometimes we wonder the whys. The why was it James? There's a lot of other apostles. I mean, if this is one of the inner beloved of the Lord, why James? Why didn't he see and that he was safeguarded, or that somehow he was taken care of? And that's just one of the things that we look at from a human point of view. Somehow we are going to be able to understand what God is doing. And what I'm thinking of is the fact that we see it from a worldly point of view, that how horrible it was for James to be executed. But James is not going to have to live the life that his brother John is, and not only watching many of the other beloved suffer, but he's going to be with the Lord. So James quickly is taken to be with the Lord. Doesn't sound like something you want to console Christians with. We do that a lot whenever we have saints that die, and trying to console them, is saying that we know now that brother or sister in Christ is with the Lord. It still doesn't change the hurt and the confusion, like what's going on here. Now, the church there must really be under a tremendous amount of stress and experiencing anxiety, because now you have James executed, Peter in prison. So who's next? What's going to happen? And again, the insinuation is that this is all in order to appease the Jews. Now, Peter's an escape artist. He's already shown that he can escape pretty efficiently. Remember, they're not seeing that this is God they're going up against. And so Herod, in his great efforts, put what they call 4 squads, which means 24 hours a day. Basically, he was going to have double the guard. Instead of normally, if you really worried about a prisoner, you'd put one soldier chained to him inside the cell. You'd have one soldier standing outside the cell to guard them. Herod's not taking any chances. So he's got 2 chained to him inside the cell. He has 2 outside the cell. And so you see the idea that no matter what man tries to do, they're not going to stop God. You look at the power that this man has as a leader, that somehow the world leaders have this tremendous amount of power that they can wield against God's people, and yet it doesn't work, does it? Not able at all. Hey, John, good to see you join us this morning too. So we see this idea, this conflict, because what it triggers with the church, instead of this, we don't see them scattering, fleeing for their lives. We see that they come together and earnest prayer for Peter. This word, when it's in earnest, is this idea in the Greek of this outstretching, outreaching, this pouring out of their heart in continual petition to God. And when we think of prayer, a lot of times we need to remember that, God is listening to our prayers. So we have the world trying to bring their force upon against the church to stop it. And then we have God's people going to prayer. And who wins? God's people in prayer. So the night that he is in the middle of the night, an angel appears. He doesn't understand. He seems to be not really understanding if it's a vision or not. And then, of course, I love the idea that this angel, it's so descriptive, the kicking kicking Peter in the side to kind of get him to wake up, and then, hastening out of the cell. It's when he gets into the street that he comes to himself and he realizes, wow, this has to be an angel, that the Lord has sent his angel to rescue me. And he also knows I'm not only just being rescued from Herod, but he knows that it's also the will of the people, the population. Everybody's wanting to, basically see him martyred as well. So let's go ahead and let's pick up and read, starting in verse 12. If you got comments or you want to participate, I can see the comments. I'll try to keep my eye on watching them as well. So now let's go ahead and pick up in 12. And Peter's on the street. He's come to his senses and realizing what's happening. And so in 12, when he realized this, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose other name was Mark, where many were gathered together and were praying. And when he had knocked at the door of the gateway, a servant girl named Rhoda came to answer. Recognizing Peter's voice, in her joy, she did not open the gate, but ran in and reported that Peter was standing at the gate. And they said to her, "You're out of your mind." But she kept insisting that it was so. And they kept saying, "It's his angel." So, in the middle of our prayer and our petitions, many times, God is answering our prayers. And this, what I see here, is this pouring out of their hearts, petitioning God. The answer is there. And the people are so focused that it's like, okay, no, they can't. You're seeing. Now, what this does also show is the idea that the custom and the beliefs was that they did believe in guardian angels. So when it says it is his angel, they're referring to a guardian angel. So now, this kind of fits with what the Hebrew writer said in Hebrews 1:14 when he said about angels. He said, "Are they not ministering spirits sent out to serve for the sake of those who are to inherit salvation?" A lot of times we forget that statement in our daily lives. I don't know, how God is providentially taking care of me, but when I look at this story, and as much as we try to distance ourselves from the answering and all of this and saying it's an apostle and it's in the first century, there's a very important lesson for us as well. One, the earnest prayer is heard by God. That we can see that God will send us an answer. Now, Peter was visibly able to see this angel and take care of him. But as the Hebrew writer says, that angels are still active. I mean, he's not talking in past tense. The Hebrew writer is saying, did you not know that angels used to be ministering spirits? No. Hebrew writer is indicating that they're still doing this role. I think that as we're earnestly petitioning God, that we need to trust and enjoy peace that we can have from that, knowing that God is involved. I can't also help but think about the vision that Jacob had about Jacob's ladder and God bringing peace to Jacob and trying to show him that God is interaction. He's interactive with the world. He's not some distant father, unaware of what's going on, and occasionally, sends Michael, sends an angel here. No, the dream there with Jacob was showing these angels ascending and descending, and the activeness in which God is involved in the world every day. And this is one of these where, of course, it was manifested, and the people here, even the Jewish people, believed when they said, well, they believed in guardian angels. I do not believe in the concept of guardian angels the way it's being taught today, but I do believe that angels, as the Hebrew writer said, are active in our lives today. The other thing that when we look at that is to have faith, like Jesus said in John 15:17. He said, if you abide in me and my words abide in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. Now, that's not an open ticket to ask for anything, to ask for pay raise, to ask for, new cars or things. But look at the way that Jesus said this in John 15. He's saying that if you're abiding in me, which means you're in a good relationship, you're in fellowship with Jesus, which means you're spiritually minded, you're living right with God as best as you can. And he says, but his words abide in you, which means you if the words are in you, that means you have a level of understanding. You have a level of understanding of what God's plan is, what God's will is, what God is wanting to accomplish. And so if they're in you, the things in which you're going to pray for, you're going to pray with knowledge. And so with that in mind, we know not to ask for a Rolls Royce to be able to get us to our job. We know that to ask for a $500,000 house to live in because we need a place for shelter. We understand that. And too often, in other words, people are asking amiss, as James said. James saying that, the reason you're not getting your prayers answered is because you're asking for the wrong things. You're asking with the wrong motives. So it's important for us to remember that as well and have faith in it. So, and that he hears all prayers. All prayers from his saints are answered. So be aware and think about, what was the answer? You ever had somebody you're talking to and they ask you a question and then you give the answer and they all of a sudden look and they ask the question again? You're like, I already answered. I answered your question. You keep asking me these questions. So I think sometimes we do that to God, is that we're not paying attention. And whether it's exactly the way we want it to be, or maybe God says it's a no, but please be assured that God is answering our prayers. So Peter's at the door. And so what does Peter do? Knocks. But Peter kept knocking, starting in 16. And when they opened, they saw him and they were amazed. But motioning to them with his hand to be silent, he described to them how the Lord had brought him out of the prison. And he said, tell these things to James and to the brothers. And he departed and he went to another place. And when the day came, there was no little disturbance among the soldiers over what had become of Peter. So after he finally got their attention and they let him inside, they're amazed. Their prayers were answered. Isn't that what happens with us? Many times we're asking the most powerful God with all power, all abilities, and a lot of times, when we receive the answer, that we're amazed. It's like, and I think that's just a normal response. I'm not trying to pick on this group of Christians, this idea that somehow they're amazed. I think we should stand amazed at what God is doing for us and glorifying. But Peter quickly, he seems to have some urgency, calms them down because I'm sure there's an emotional welcome that's going on. And then he tells them the story. This is, I think, as well as we need to be humble about it, but we need, I think, also to share the victories that we've accomplished from God. And I say that because sometimes people are constantly, maybe over-glorifying things that are happening in their lives per se, but I think there's an important aspect because there's some people that are so humble at times that I find that it would be wonderful to be able to share something that they've been doing. Many times a beautiful Christian will do something or ask me to do something, or I'll find out that they're doing, but they don't want anyone to know. They'll say, don't say anything. I want it to be quiet. And you almost want to share it, because I think it helps to encourage everybody and to see the way that God did answer your prayers. We love to hear that. I mean, we have prayer requests all the time, and it's so encouraging to be able to see that response. And so when we look at the Christians gathered here, the amazement, and then the report of how that prayer was answered, and the power that God is being able to display in spite of all the power of the government and of King Herod as well. So of course, verse 18, when he says there that, when the day came, there was no little disturbance. This would create an amazing amount of panic. Again, how do you escape from the inside of the prison that's so heavily guarded personally? I mean, there are 2 soldiers chained to the man. There's 2 soldiers standing outside the gate of the cell. How did you lose him? It'd be one thing to say, okay, everybody fell asleep, but when you're chained to him, how can you pick your lock and not drop the chains or something and not somehow disturb? And I'll tell you right now, the Roman soldiers that are on duty, they know better than to sleep. Sleeping on watch was punishable by death. Losing your prisoner was punishable by death. I mean, today, when a guard escapes from a jail, let a reprimand, might get fired, and maybe retrained, but not death. I mean, I think that if we were to do something like that, I don't think you'd have a lot of jailbreaks, because the guards would be so much in tune with what's going on to make sure the prisoners were secured, because their lives were on the line. And so that's exactly that. That was the practice in verse 19. And after Herod searched for him and did not find him, and examined the sentries and ordered that they be put to death. Then he went to Judea, to Caesarea, and spent some time there. Then he leaves. And why is Luke tracking this? Because I think it fits. Because we're talking about the power of authority that's trying to wield itself against God's people. God's people with the power of God on their side, and showing who's winning. And that's a great lesson for us as well, because a lot of times that's exactly the way we feel. We feel with the power of the authority of the world and government and all the evil that's out there, and then who's on our side? Right? Good question. I mean, because I don't see a lot of people hanging with me when I'm suffering. I don't seem to have that personally with me when I'm late at night and wrapped with anxiety and concerns and such. But that's why this book is so wonderful, is that we can look at this and see this type of power and interaction that God has, not only with those in the first century, but also we should be assured that it's happening in our lives as well. Since we're kind of where we're at in time, I'm going to go ahead and stop there. We're going to pick up in verse 20 next week Okay. So John says the response to Rhoda reminds me of how we pray fervently and fail to demonstrate our faith that God answers prayers. Yeah, that kind of shock and awe whenever God answers our prayers and then we turn around and we see it happening. It's a little overwhelming. And then the response to the people that are receiving it. So when Rhoda goes back and then says, hey, Peter's here. And how did they respond? Prayer's answered. So somebody comes and says, your prayer's answered. And it's like, maybe it's just his angel. So thank you, John. I'm glad to see everybody that we have all the way from India. It was wonderful. Like I said, if you have comments, I'll give a moment here. We'll kind of give an opportunity. I keep getting caught up in my teaching. I got to pay attention to see what's going on online with this, what we've covered this morning. We have a little bit of a delay, so sometimes it takes a little while by the time it pops up to where we can see what's going on. But if we don't get anything else, before we wrap up, I'd like to invite you to be here at 10:45 for worship this afternoon. This morning we're looking at the church that Jesus built. And then this afternoon we're looking in 2 Thessalonians, looking at the man of lawlessness that's supposed to appear just before the Lord's return. This coming Wednesday, we're going to continue our Bible study of characters in the Bible. We're going to start with Joseph. And I think they're exciting studies, of course. I'm enjoying them, so I hope that you're enjoying them as well. And so Cindy, John, and I guess I'll just call you Jack 72 from India. Welcome. I think that's our farthest away visitor that we've had online, but that's exciting. So God bless everybody, and we'll see you soon.